so hopefully you heard all of those sounds. It's very important information being encoded there. However, League of Legends is often criticized because their sound design is very muddy. It's very difficult to hear one of these sounds versus the other. In fact, the situation is a little more severe. You may not be familiar with this game, but if you were, hopefully you realized the video you just saw was separate from the audio you were listening to. Yes, it's actually that bad. So one of the problems that they've identified in this case study is that there may be a lack of dynamic mixing, which is when we want to make certain sounds louder than others. It's pretty severe in League of Legends case, at a point that this game does not even have footsteps inside the audio landscape. But now we're going to look at how people can do it right. And we're going to see the same example or similar situation from the game called Overwatch.
Hammer down! Oh, let's break it down!
龍が我が敵を食らう!
Oh, let's break it down!
Were you able to hear them that time? Probably yes, right? It's much more clear. And there's a lot of tricks which can go into an audio designer's tool set to leverage these sounds, to highlight these sounds, and to make sure that the information a player needs to hear is heard. Whether that's a matter of making some sounds louder than others, or just completely ignoring some sounds when it's not most relevant to the player. This is relevant for our students in CS146 because it's likely that you're going to be downloading sounds from many different sources. And even if the sound is really juicy and impactful, the big question is whether or not they're going to work together. Right? So this is not something we've explored so far, maybe, but if you have some elements that are very juicy, they don't necessarily work in concert well. So I don't know if this is a good analogy, but you may have like the best juice of the orange, and you may have really good juice of a coconut, which is essentially milk. But like the best orange juice and milk are going to taste horrible together, right? So work needs to be done into finding the best production or finding the best sounds, but there's a significant amount of work that has to go after that fact in making sure these sounds work well in concert together. Thank you. Now introducing our speaker.
So as you can tell, our theme this week is game sound design, and so our speaker is Caleb Epps, who's a senior sound designer at Sledgehammer Games. He started his career in the game industry working at Harmonic Studios, which makes the Rock Band series, so obviously the series that takes sound very seriously. He briefly worked at EA, and now he's at Sledgehammer. Recently, he did the sound, or contributed at least to the sound for Call of Duty World War II. And today he's going to help give you some practical advice on doing sound and audio for your games.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Give me half a second to plug in, but I really want to dive in immediately. I'm not going to take the bait. I really want to dive into that case study and talk about how League of Legends didn't necessarily get a fair shake there. But we'll actually talk a little bit more about Overwatch later, because I do agree that it's like a great example of informational sound design used really well. But before we get there, I need to lay out some basics. So the title of this talk is Game Audio, Path from Buttons to Beeps. I like alliterations. So as I said, I'm Caleb. So I work at Sledgehammer Games. I've worked a bunch of other places, including Harmonix and EA, as was said before. So over the 10 years I've been making games, I've had the sort of good fortune to ship a bunch of games and to contribute a lot to the sound design. So when we talk about game audio, I like to kind of break game audio down into, I'm going to break this talk down into two major chunks. One is sound design, and the other is music. Do we have any like music majory people here today? None whatsoever. Homeboy in the back. Second half of the talk, it's like all you. We'll just sit down together and nerd out about music. It'll be great. But music implementation is like a really important part of soundscapes. So we're going to talk about that in the second half. But for the first half, I want to focus on sound design, gameplay sound effects, voiceover, and UI sound effects. Those are sort of three major buckets that I like to think of game audio in. So how do you do it? What? Ridiculous. Yeah. Alright, let's try again. That would be really bad. All this black and white goodness that I prepared for you, it wouldn't show. Okay. I'll try not to move. Cool. Okay. So, awesome. So let's talk about the first three. And before you do that, you kind of need to talk about how you do it. And I want to break that down into like a three-step process. And rather than starting from the microphone and going all the way to your ear, I'm actually going to sort of go a little bit backwards. And this is, I think, a really important way to think about game audio. And I was sort of in the middle of grad school at CalArts when I started thinking about audio in this way. Thinking about audio from the data that's in the game, thinking backwards to the sound design that you have to implement, what you want to come out of the speakers. And that really, where the rubber meets the road there, that's called implementation. That's like game data making sound plan. We'll get into that in a minute. We'll talk about creation, a few different ways to do that, and then we'll talk about packaging, how sounds are packaged up, loaded into memory, and played in your game. If we want to go sort of deeper into that, we can do that in the Q&A, but just understanding that from a baseline level is important. So before we talk about game audio, I want to talk a little bit about linear audio. Linear audio is the type of audio that you see in films or television, anything where time is sort of, and what is happening is fixed and moving forward. I realize that time is always moving forward, but I sort of think about it a little differently when it comes to games. You have picture in linear audio, and that drives sound, that goes into your ear. Cool. Pretty easy, right? But in game audio, you have this pesky thing called interactivity. And so interactivity, the input from the player, that's what drives potentially the picture on the screen, which then drives audio, and then drives what you're hearing. But sometimes interactivity can just skip what's going on screen and go directly out the speakers into your player's ears. And that's really one of the main values of game audio, is because sound can deliver information to the player in a much speedier fashion than visuals can. So it's a great way to deliver information to a player. So, now that I've sort of laid down like some really easy basics, let's talk a little bit about implementation. Sort of at its simplest layer, you have input from the player, or a game state, and that's driving through some logic, and that's creating what I call an event. And it's an easy term to use because it's a term that a lot of audio middleware packages use, and it's just an easy way to talk about like, hey, do a sound thing, that's an event. That event then works on a WAV file, or depending on your platform, an OGG Vorbis file or an MP3. It doesn't really matter. We're talking about, sound samples, and a WAV file is like my personal favorite one. And then that goes out your speakers, right? So I want to talk first, I want to show an example of sort of a complex state of implementation. Implementation can take a lot of inputs from the game and use it to drive the logic that I'm talking about. So I want to play a little clip from Call of Duty World War II. It's a sequence where you're rescuing a little girl from a basement in Germany and taking her out to safety. Now, the particular system that I want you to pay attention to is the vocalizations of the little girl. These are actually cut from a set of 4 ad-libs that we did with her in the studio. We got an amazing young actress in. We played a video of the gameplay sequence and just had her ad-lib. I then diced all that up and built a system so that every time you play it, you got a little bit of a different flavor. And I'll talk a little bit about the gameplay information that goes into a type of system like this, but this is sort of an example of like, probably way more than you need, but this is sort of where things are at.
It's all right. I'll protect you.
life involves a lot of explosions. So, to explain what was happening in that scene, the vocalizations of the little girl Anna were controlled by a whole number of factors. They were controlled by how close you were to Nazi soldiers, how long it had been, how many frames, since our game runs at 60 frames a second, and so we're always thinking in terms of frames. How many frames has it been since you first saw that enemy? Were there any explosions nearby? How afraid was Anna before this new sort of source of fear was injected into her psyche? And we use all that to then drive a sort of sound selector that then draws from buckets of sort of pre-sliced samples of Anna saying things. Sometimes we also take into account, okay, well, how long has it been since she screamed? It doesn't make sense to have her scream, you know, a lot in a very, very short period of time if a bunch of explosions happen to go off based on the combat, because the combat can change. Your route through the combat can change. So we take all these factors into account, and we build a fear number. And that fear number is always going downward, because you can have a spike of fear, but then you get over it over time. And we use that fear heuristic to drive our audio selections. And so that's one example of like a highly over-engineered system for like a 5-minute gameplay sequence in a AAA game. So you don't usually need like that amount of nerdiness, but I like nerdy things, so I sort of went off and wrote a bunch of Lua to drive that system, and it ended up working out great. But for the games that you're working on, you're mostly going to be dealing with pretty simple events. You know, a game state happens, some amount of logic happens, and you say, I want to play a sound. So cool, you can play a sound. Or, I want to stop a sound that's already playing. Sweet. I want to adjust its pitch or volume. And now here are a couple things that we were sort of talking a little bit about earlier during the case studies. Ducking and mixer snapshots. Ducking is the concept of turning down other sounds in order to let one sound speak. A mixer snapshot is taking groups of sounds, turning them up or turning them down based on a situation. And that's really important for driving listener focus and making sure that the players are always getting the most important information at any given time. As I said, you can play a sound based on gameplay info. That often also comes into account when you're thinking about UI sounds. You can crossfade between sounds. You can apply an effect. You can adjust a parameter. The world is kind of your oyster when you're doing game audio. You can kind of do anything you want, but there's always sort of budgetary constraints to think about. Game audio tends to be the last in the chain. And this is where I put my game audio chip on my shoulder and complain about the rest of the games industry. We tend to work last in the chain. And we also tend to have the most constrained memory budgets and CPU and GPU budgets. And so we always have to be thinking creatively about how to get the most bang for our buck, the best listener experience for every kilobyte, or you know, sort of clock cycle. We need to use everything sort of to the nth degree. And that's really the fun creative challenge of game audio. So, I want to talk a little bit about implementation and how you do it. A lot of you, I bet, are working in commercially available engines like Unreal or Unity, and they offer pretty good solutions for game audio. I've worked in both of these engines pretty extensively. Unreal Engine gives tons and tons of control. They actually have their own separate audio implementation language, which you're actually not really supposed to use anymore. So use blueprints if you're working on Unreal. Do your audio in blueprints. It comes straight from the audio coder Epic. And Unity is fine. I like it a little less. I tend to write my own sort of audio middleware that sits on top of Unity and port that around, because I like to think about audio in a slightly different way, with a large container of sounds and then events calling into that large container of sounds, in order to play it. Unity has this sort of distributed idea of you put sounds on things, but then your sound is everywhere throughout the game, and it's really hard to manage. Unity also doesn't generally handle asset randomization and pitch and volume randomization very easily, so it's just nice to sort of wrap all that up in one thing. And so I use sort of a bastardization of Wise built on top of Unity that I wrote in C Sharp. Wise is great. You should use it if you can. They have great plugins to the major engines, and it offers tons of flexibility. You can even write your own audio effects if you want to get into DSP code. You can also use Fmod. Fmod is also great. The folks at Double Fine use Fmod, and it's fantastic. It has more of a legacy, I think, because I like to hate on things, but it has sort of a more of a like timeline-based approach to sound design that's a lot more similar to a digital audio workstation rather than a logic-based flow. I came up using MaxMSP and Reactor and thinking about sound as I'm talking about it now, as events connected to logic, much as object-oriented programming works. So if you sort of want to think about audio that way, I recommend this sort of approach. You can also write your own. I was just talking about it. And if you're working professionally in the industry, a lot of different developers have their own sets of tools. For example, Call of Duty runs in this like unholy amalgamation of like C# and Lua and all sorts of different languages, all running, and it's all proprietary. But it's really fun because there's a lot of flexibility. But if you're thinking about doing game audio professionally, you should be ready to learn and ready to pick up any new tool set and ready to not get sort of worried or scared when you have to learn something new. That's like the fun of doing game. So, I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about sound creation, just real quick, sort of how do you do it. We talked earlier about downloading things off of the web, sound effects and stuff like that. I would beg you to not, because it will put all of us sound designers out of work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of more traditional ways to do it. So first off, like you can take a microphone and you can use like a really expensive one. That's like a Sheps CMIT 5 Mini. It costs a lot and sounds pretty good. You can use one of these handheld recorders like a Sony M10 or a Roland EO6. They're awesome. I have a Sony M10 over there in my bag. I carry it with me everywhere. Like probably 85 to 90% of the sounds for Call of Duty World War II were recorded on one of these handheld recorders. Hey, Christian, can you pass it to me? Just to show you, like, it's like a $150 recorder, and it's, like, wild. So, this thing, like, you don't need expensive mics to record AAA audio. You just need to, like, get good source and then be creative. You can also use your phone to do it. Like, you all carry around microphones with you all the time, and it doesn't matter, like, how high quality it is. All that matters is it's just like cool and new and it sounds good. So then you can like, you know, run it through your computer, use Ableton Live, use Reaper. Please use Reaper, it's awesome. Or Audacity is free. And then you end up with a WAV file. And that's the sort of beauty of game audio is like, in the end, it doesn't really matter how you get there because you're ending up with just sounds. You're ending up with sound files and you're playing them back. So, here's an example of how we make sound files at Sledgehammer. here's an example of taking those raw assets and now cooking them out into a game asset. Now we slow it down a bit. Put our bass on it again. Here's sort of a bit of a cooking show of a bunch of different stuff. So here's our bass layer. Now we'll add some debris, a little bit of low end. And here's sort of the full gestalt in the game. So that's sort of how we make stuff. Just a couple of notes, like I want to just give you like a few sort of like secret sauce little tips about game sound. One is utilize the power of the 808 kick drum. Like it is the greatest and it is helpful for anything that you just want to give more punch to. Don't use it on everything. As we were saying before, you need to make sure that you know what's important and you want to drive focus. But anything where you need just like a little bit more oomph, a little bit more just like a little punch, take an 808 kick drum that you can get like a sample of one like anywhere. It's really easy. Pitch it down more if you want. And then chop it short. So if you take the tail off and you just want a little, and that's going to add like so much punch to your sound effects. So that's like tip number one. Tip number two, as you saw in the video, experiment with slowing stuff down. Like that's like the trick, right? Like if you want to make stuff big, just take recordings and slow them down, and that'll give you that like bass layer. Now you're gonna have, what you're gonna do when you slow things down is you're gonna lose the top layer. So you're gonna need to add another element to balance that out. My third little tip is to actually, it sounds kind of dumb, actually design your sounds. But when you want every single sort of part of a sound when you're putting it together to have a role to play. So if something is like, this is the low body, take out all the high-end stuff. Use another sound, another layer to play that role, and take out all the low end from that. And that will keep your sounds like clean and crisp, and so that your mix doesn't get too muddy. Cool. So other creation stuff. Sometimes you're not going for that like dumb action movie over the top kind of vibe, like a Call of Duty, and maybe you're going for something more specific. And there's a ton of different sound creation tools you can use inside of your computer to get to your wave, right? You can use a sampler like Contact. This is an emulator of the Super NES sound chip. I love the Super NES sound chip. You can call it the Super NES if you want to. I am like a huge hater on the Genesis sound chip. I like don't like FM synthesis because I'm weird, but that's just me. But I know, I'm sorry. I'm all about that subtracting. But the Super NES sound chip is rad, and you can actually, if for some reason you happen to have a collection of ROMs that maybe you ripped off of your, pristine cartridge collection, you can actually drop those ROMs into this chip emulator and pull the samples from it. And there's just tons and tons of cool stuff. Just going through like the Final Fantasy VI like ROM and pulling out all the synth presets and looking at all the samples, you can learn so much about how they got that sound. And then, like I said, you can download sounds from Freesound, but don't do it because you can make your own now. and they'll be so much better. And then there's all sorts of other stuff. You know, if you really want to go down that chiptune route, you can work in trackers and build sounds on spreadsheets like they did in the old days. Or you could record it all live and play it live. You know, like was it last year that Darren gave this talk? You know, like he basically makes albums, you know, for his games, and like that's rad. So you can do that. All right, so let's talk quickly about packaging. Basically, what ends up happening, and there are lots of different ways to do this. You can do this sort of on a individual sound asset basis, or you can sort of take your wave files and kind of package them up into like what's called a sound bank. And a sound bank then gets loaded into memory, which then gets, you know, decoded at runtime and played back. It's really, really valuable in order to keep your memory budgets down to think sort of strategically about how you want to bank up your sounds. You know, how you want the game to load and unload things when it doesn't need them. If you're making, you know, a small game that doesn't have a lot of sound data, this isn't really something that you need to worry about. So this might not be applicable to any of your projects. But when we were trying to squeeze Beatles Rock Band onto the Wii, you know, I had about, what did I say for Sean? Like 3.5 megabytes. Thank you for remembering. 3.5 megabytes of memory to work with for all the sound effects and ambient sounds. Because everything else was taken up with other stuff. And we hadn't really done a good job at Harmonix thinking about the Wii as a target platform. We were developing for the 360 and the PS3 at that time, and they had much higher memory budgets. But we're like, oh no, now we have to squeeze this game down onto the Wii. Sound designers, you've got 3.5 megs. Sorry. Okay. Made it work. We had to downsample a bunch of stuff, cut a bunch of loops out, make things super small loops, and just, you know, try to really focus on the stuff that was the most important. So, when you're trying to focus on the stuff that's most important, that's where audio direction and sound design really happens. So, how do you set the direction for your sound? I've been through this process a few times. I love games where the aesthetics of a game flow out of the game mechanics. Now, it's really easy to say that, and it's a lot harder to do it. These are, you know, the best games in the industry do this. You know, sort of one prime example is like Braid does this incredibly well. But that should be your guiding principle when trying to figure out, okay, what's the right sound to make here? Think about the game mechanics, and if mechanics aren't present in that moment, think about the desired emotion that you want the player to feel, and let that sort of guide your directions. Now, that desired emotion is always going to be filtered through your personal aesthetics, and that's exactly what you want to do, right? That's exactly what makes a game yours. You know, when I was sort of audio directing for Shardbound, which was this like ill-fated tactics CCG game. It was awesome. I think it's still available on Steam, but I don't know if the servers are still up. But I was listening to a lot of like positive, sort of synth poppy kind of stuff, and I was like, that's the feeling that I want to evoke. This idea of, you know, sailing fearlessly into the future, and that's what I want players to feel. And that type of music, that type of sound design is like what said that to me. And so the best that I can do is give that to people and hope they feel the same. You can do juxtaposition. Like, you can absolutely do it. If you really want to make like a strong statement with your sound design in opposition to the other aesthetics of the game, that's fine. Make deadly sure that you're on point there, and like test it with people. Because you might be like, oh yeah, this totally makes sense, setting this against this. But just make sure that like you're getting the right emotion across. So this, again, dovetails nicely with the case studies that we talked about at the beginning. Sound, like anything in a game, is a design object. I've had, you know, many late night conversations with my, you know, coworkers and partners in other design disciplines, and we sort of always came around to the same metaphor, that you can design the most beautiful chair that you want. And if it is like, if you sit down in it and it's uncomfortable, there's a bad chair. Even if it's like the most beautiful thing in the world. So, sound design and successful sound design has to be functional. That function may just be to elicit an emotion, but oftentimes sound needs to have a gameplay purpose as well. Especially when it comes to competitive games, and especially when it comes to multiplayer games. So, I want to sort of break sound, the sort of purpose of sound, into a couple of camps. Iconic sound and representational sound. Now, when I'm talking about iconic sound, I don't actually mean this. Sorry that I scared you. Welcome. Hi. And I don't really mean something like this, right? Those are sounds that have become iconic because they're recognizable. But when I say iconic sound, I mean a sound design that is representative of a piece of information. And this makes me realize I should maybe turn down a couple of notches. Respect your ears. There we go. So here's a couple of sounds similar to what we heard before.
It's high noon.
Right? Then if you play Overwatch, you know that you need to get to cover.
Nerf this!
And this means that you probably shouldn't bunch up, right? You know, as I was going through some of the Overwatch sounds, because Overwatch has this great sound design tenet. They gave a talk at GDC last year about how their sort of North Star for sound design is that they wanted players to be able to play without seeing the game. They wanted players to be able to play the game by sound. And I'm like, that's rad. And that really supports this idea of picking which sounds need to be iconic. Both of those sounds are from ultimate abilities. Now, ultimate abilities provide two really important pieces of information. One is that a very powerful attack or buff or something that can change the tide of a game is incoming. So understand that that's happened. Second piece of information is that that ability for that character is now on cooldown and won't be happening for the next X amount of time. And so that means that there is both a danger and an opportunity that all the players in the game need to keep track of. So this is a sound that needs to be called out in the sort of field of play because it's really important to an Overwatch match. Should also, if you have time, go through the other voice files in the game. You can find them online. They're pretty easy. People have ripped them out of the game. Don't use them in your game, but listen to them to learn. And all of the non-ultimate abilities, all of the other voice lines, there's tons of great voice chatter in the game. They're not processed in the same way. All of the ultimate ability lines have this really cool sort of slapback delay on them, and the rest of the voice lines are kind of dry. They're run through the in-game reverb, but they don't have this special feeling to them. So there's both a special feeling that's imparted in the lines themselves, and these lines, unlike a lot of the lines, are singular. There's only ever one of them, and that's really, really important for iconic sound. Like, you should just have one, because, like, if you have more than one and you're like, oh, I'm gonna do like lots of different ones, but they all mean the same thing, you're just confusing players. Don't do it. It's not worth it, because you're just adding more cognitive load that's not necessary onto your players. So yeah, that's sort of iconic sound in a nutshell. Choose a couple of sounds to really make iconic in your game, really gameplay important stuff. The rest of your sounds are going to be representative or representation. So here's just an example. I felt like it was important to be like, what's the sort of state of the art for what Caleb's doing? These are the last 10 sounds I made. So that was my day today. So those were the last 10 sounds I made. It turns out in the next game we're working on, like, things break and get hit with things. Wow. Amazing. But all of those sounds, those are for one gameplay, right? So I wanted to have a set of 10 sounds when this, piece of wood was breaking. Now, on top of that 10 sounds, I'm also adding another set of 10 secondary sounds that have debris that get added on. So that means you've got a lot more combinations. You've got 100 sounds now, if each of those sounds are randomized, right? You have break A with debris, like break 1 with debris 6, and so on and so forth. Now, the combinatorics get even greater when you're layering things on even more. Some of the guns in Call of Duty have 7 or 8 layers, and they're all random, and they're all pitched up and down slightly, and they're all turned up and down slightly in their volume every time. And that's what's needed in order to amortize that sound over thousands and thousands of playbacks, so that the player doesn't get tired of it, and also so that it is representative of a thing in reality. Now, I'm going to sort of leave this part of the talk talking about sound design. We'll talk about music next. But I just want to leave you with one thing, which is that, whenever you're sound designing, if you go after reality, you're going to be disappointed. I always like to think about sound design as just think of the dream version of the sound, or how something sounds like you remember it, and let that guide you, not what something actually sounds like. And sometimes the sources that you need to use to get there aren't the actual thing, but it's actually something different. So keep an open mind when you're recording stuff. Carry a microphone with you if you're really want to just start building up a library of stuff, and just record stuff that sounds cool. And then it doesn't have to have any connection with what's coming out, but the connection that you want to make is that you want to make it so it's oh yeah, that's what I want this 808 kick drum to sound like. That's what I want this shaking hands to sound like. Actual shaking hands sounds dumb. It doesn't sound like anything. But maybe you want somebody to feel empowered and inspired when they're shaking somebody's hand. So you really want to punch it up, right? But you might have to find different sources to make that happen, and that's okay. That's the beauty of sound design. So let's take a moment, take a little break. Do any of you have questions on the sound design side of things? If you want to talk about game music, we can kind of start doing that, but I've got a whole sort of mini talk about that too.
So when you're picking objects to make sounds with, like metal things, what exactly are you thinking about? Do you just think about oh, I've heard the way that thing sounds before, so I should use it, or is it more I want to see how this sounds, then you use it, and you're oh, that would sound really good in this scenario?
Yeah, it's usually the case where you've got. I'm lucky because I've sort of got a bunch of sounds that that I need to make that are sort of always out in front of me, right? So in general, in my life, I just sort of go around and I'm this is cool. I want to record this because it sounds cool. Or I might just if the rare occurrence happens that I don't have a mic with me, I'll just remember it. For example, our team went up to Mendocino because there was a rotted out tree stump that our audio director had hiked by with his son, and he was I'm gonna need that at some point. And so we took a trip up and we dug around in this thing, and it made all these awesome debris sounds. But yeah, it's really just record up front, maybe with no endpoint in your mind, but it's you always sort of keep a memory bank of what you've recorded in the past usually, because you've got that physical connection of actually focusing and paying attention to something. And then when the opportunity comes, then you just put it on a hard drive, walk away from it, and then the opportunity will present itself, and you're oh, that my mom's squeaky dishwasher door, which is a real thing. My mom's dishwasher door is terrifying, but that would be really awesome for this moment. And then you just go look it up, and hopefully sound designers are horrifically meticulous, so we're label everything. And it'll you just go and get mom's dishwasher door and put it in and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, cool, throw it away, find something else. But yeah, it's just really just go out and record everything. Any other questions?
So because of like the kind of space limitations you're always under, how often do you find yourself having to like reuse sounds for different events with like processing, and how do you go about selecting what you will like do that to?
Yeah, and another interesting to sort of knock on from that a little bit is like, when do you choose to have like 100 variations of something? It's tough, and like you kind of have to just massage it. I sort of like to, and this is sort of me as like grizzled old veteran developer, I'm just like cram custom sounds in for everything, and then like ask forgiveness from your engineer friends when the memory budgets go over. But in all honesty, it's really just like you kind of want to reuse sounds either for you can group sounds into things that are similar, and so it's okay to like, have this UI sound be the same thing because it's generally conveying the same idea, or you can try to space sounds out away from each other to avoid the player noticing that they're the same thing. So it's either like, got two sounds, right, and these are like two events, and you need to use the same sound for them, right? So either put them really close together so they're conceptually unified, or try to put them like as far apart as possible so that nobody notices. Yeah.
Is there like a rule of thumb for your average game action that you want to have like varying sounds? How many do you record so that the average person, like if there's 10 variants, then no one's going to really notice?
Yeah, the like general watchword is about 10 for something that repeats a lot, 5 for something that repeats less. That's at least the going wisdom on our team. But it's funny because there's a lot of stylistic differences around the industry. For example, if you look at a lot of Japanese games have very, very few footstep variations, and that's like a theme. But yeah, it really just depends. Like everything can be validated, right? Because we live in a day where you can have, hopefully, your game is like up and playable all the time. If your goal is for people to just not notice it, then I'd say start with 5, and then if you need more, add more. But like, just see if people notice. It's really just something that you can test. But right now in AAA, at least at Sledge, we're like, yeah, this is gonna happen a lot. Put 10 in. This is gonna happen like sometimes. Put 5 in. That's our general go-to.
When you're working in a franchise like Call of Duty, is there any continuity between like reusing sound effects from previous games in order to make it feel more like a Call of Duty game?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And that's, to be honest, that's like a constant battle, because we always think that we can do better this time, right? And it's something that, sort of as you work in a lot of games, I've sort of been able to let go of a little bit. But, for example, I have a friend who worked on the Dead Space franchise. It's like this horror shooter at EA. And there's one weapon that he really, really, really wanted to replace, because he was like, this sounds like garbage. It's so bad. I hate it. But when he swapped it up, everybody was like, what happened to the plasma cutter? It's different now. I don't like it. It's the same idea of like, the Mario coin. Like, you wouldn't want to replace the Mario coin. It's great. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that carries over. There are subtle ways that you can modernize sounds and try to walk that line between, adding a little bit of oomph, a little bit of high-end fidelity if you can. If you can, go back to some of the source recordings and see like, oh, okay, this sound, in order to fit into memory, had to be downsampled to, 22K and stuff like that. Let's bring it up and make it high fidelity. But yeah, there's always stuff that you bring over. It's like the hit marker in Call of Duty. Like, when you hit somebody, it makes this like sound, and it's like, I don't love it. But people think it's necessary. So yeah, I mean, it's just a constant battle. We always want to make new stuff, but it's important. The game always has to come first, and like making it feel right and deliver the right feeling to players. That's always like number one. getting to do cool sound design. Like if it's in service of that, great. But if not, then you shouldn't do it. One more question.
I was just wondering, how do you come up with sounds for things that don't necessarily exist in the real world? Like if you're making a sci-fi game or a fantasy game, and there's a thing that, like an alien or a monster that doesn't really exist in the real world, how do you come up with that?
I mean, in some cases it's just like mess about. I'm a big like modular synthesizer nerd. So when I'm doing sci-fi sounds, I just like patch things into my synthesizer and twiddle knobs and record it all and try to find stuff that's cool. With creature sounds and stuff like that, it's really just like, I usually just like drink a bunch of water and gurgle into a microphone and see what comes out and like play around with effects. It's a lot of discovery through play in the case of finding sound effects that don't exist yet. But you really just, you just sort of dream about it. You might, sort of be working on a sound, and it might come to you in a dream, it might come to you in the shower. Oh, like I want to see what it sounds like to have this thing sound like this, and then you try it, and it might be awesome, and it might not be, and if it's not, you chuck it. If it is, great. But you really just play with stuff and see what you can find. I wish I had like a better this is what you do, but that's not the case. But that's also why what I do is really fun. Cool. All right, let's talk about music. How are we doing on time? Am I doing okay? Sweet. Oh my god, music's gonna have to go so fast. Let's do it. All right. So, cool. We've done this. Now it's time for this. So, we're gonna talk a little bit about game music, and I'm gonna talk about just a few really common techniques for how you do implementation, creation, and packaging. When I talk about packaging, I'm actually talking mostly about how composers can package themselves to work well with game developers, because that is something that has often been a sort of place for friction in my career. So I have some advice. It also carries over to working with people in other disciplines, so it's cool. So, music implementation. I'm going to talk about like 3 really basic ways of doing it: looping, stacking, and stitching. So what does this mean? Like, looping is really easy, right? You just like play a looping music file. There are specific techniques you can use to make something loop seamlessly. When you're not talking about music, you split a sound file at its 0 crossing point, and then you flip-flop the pieces and crossfade them into each other. If anybody wants to get if anybody's having trouble with making seamless loops, come talk to me after and I'll walk you through it. It's like game audio 101, but it's really important to know. Looping music files a little easier to make. A lot of DAWs will handle it for you. Stacking. So this is a looping music file that then has optional layers that get added or turned on based on gameplay states. This whole thing sort of connects back to the original implementation of game logic happens, an event happens, and the music changes. So you would add new optional layers. Stitching is actually a little bit more efficient way that you can achieve the same effect as stacking. But basically, stitching will take looping music files and then can transition them into other looping music files. Sometimes you need a bridge section. So sound file A will play. When you get to a point in that file, if a piece of logic is changed, it will stitch in a transition piece. And then at the end of that transition piece, you'll move to a new file. Now, one thing that's really important if you're working on developing these systems is that all of these systems require timekeeping. So then there are a couple of ways that you can do timekeeping that are sample accurate for audio. Oftentimes, you can just sort of keep a metric counter going. You can keep time inside your game, but unfortunately what will happen is that if you drop frames, if for some reason something runs slower than anticipated, your time can get out of sync with the audio file playback. I recommend, if you're working on a music system, always checking in with your sound file. Many engines allow you to sort of query a sound file and be like, where are you? where are you in your playback, either in percentage or samples, milliseconds. Check in with that. And then check against the start point of your file, that you know it happens on a metric boundary, right? Like the sort of, you know that the start of a file happens at a specific time, save that off into a variable, and then check back in with that against the playback position of your file, and then you can account for drift in your music system. And that's just a nice way to tighten up your transitions and make sure that everything happens on beat. For composers, it's really, really important, and it can be really hard to make composers stick to this, but composers should write in locked tempo and locked meter in order for music systems to function well. Some people get really salty about this, but it's really, really important in order to keep everything flowing nicely and to have a good workflow. Now, if you're just playing a looping file, heck, do whatever you want, like transition meters, tempos, whatever, time signatures, like, I don't mind, it's just a looping file, but if you want anything to happen on beat, it's really important to have accurate timekeeping, and it's really important for your composers to keep everything in lockstep. You can also combine them all, right? You can have stacking files that stitch together, layers that turn on and off. Like I said, the world is kind of your oyster when you're designing game audio, and the same goes for music. But it's really important to always think about what's appropriate. So, I want to play a couple of examples. Hang on. No Zelda yet. There are a couple of other approaches to game music that I think are really powerful. And one is what I call the sparse approach. And that is that you have lots of open space, and you have little themelets that might play based on some gameplay information. They might just play every now and again. But it's important for the design of the game to really sort of embrace this sort of sparse feeling. So let's play some Zelda and listen to the music. So it's an exceptionally beautiful score and really effective. But it's really just little pieces, little ideas, little themelets that get sprinkled in. Another game that takes this sparse approach, although with a slightly more dense result, is the original Red Dead Redemption. I haven't yet really broken down the music system of Red Dead Redemption 2 for myself, so let's talk about the original and give it a listen.
Whoa there.
So Red Dead Redemption is put together using pieces of music that are all in the same key and all in the same meter, all the same rhythm. They can all be combined and put together in any combination based on the gameplay information. And so you can kind of just, it's kind of this salad approach, you can chuck anything in and it sounds good. But it allows the music to amortize over an entire open world game and still work and sound appropriate. It's awesome. Cool. So one last thing I want to talk about is procedural music. I'm actually not going to talk about like really procedural music, but I'm going to talk about sort of a procedural light approach, which is being done at Crystal Dynamics on their Tomb Raider series. They're using procedural systems only for the percussion in their scores. Everything else is recorded live with an orchestra and has, is stitched together using a sort of traditional stitching and stacking effect. Their percussion is all procedural. And it uses a sort of set of Markov chains based on traditional rhythmic patterns. And then all of this is tied into gameplay. See, now we have 2 enemies. We get a little bit more intense. Big enemy looking for me, so pop it up. Around, we go back to being sparse. This is the same kind of idea that I was talking about taking the little girl out of the basement. It's taking together all this data that the game presents to you and using it to create something that appropriately follows the action or seems to follow the action. So, one thing to remember whenever you're building a system, and I derisively talked about systems that I built earlier, and I'll derisively talk about systems that I build in the future. Like, the quality of the experience is always more important than the system driving it. If people can see your system working, then it's probably not doing a great job. It might make you feel really good because like you're like, I made this cool thing and it's so complex and like, look at it go. And like, that's great. Like, I derive a lot of joy from that, but that's actually not the right thing to be thinking. You should always be thinking of the experience that you're delivering to the player. What's the full gestalt? Like, how does everything come together? And is my work, or the sound work that I'm doing for this game, like, is that really contributing to the experience in a good way? So, one last thing, and I'll go through this fast because I think I'm running low on time. Implementation and how you're implementing music should be decided sort of ahead of actually writing the music because it provides really important guidelines and constraints and like, it's okay. It's okay to be in a box. Like, do your best work inside of this box. And also music is designed too. Like, make sure the same principles apply to sound design as they do in music. Make sure you're serving the mechanics, make sure you're serving the emotional intent. Now, packaging yourself. And this goes like not just for music people, not just for sound people, but this is about like working collaboratively. One of the great things about games is that it's a way for lots of people to come together and make something beautiful and bring joy to a lot of people. But like, in order to do that, you have to work together sometimes. So for working with music, and I think this can kind of extend to artwork and things like that too, I like to start with a single musical cue. Usually the one that I think is like either the most important or the one that I have like the strongest vision and opinion on, and workshop that into the ground. Like, make it great. Make it awesome. Give tons of feedback, share references, and what you like about them. Like, don't hold people to a temp score or reference and be like, well, I want it more like this Hyper Light Drifter cue. But just be like, I like this cue. we started off the class with some Hyper Light Drifter, and I have like extensive notes on that score, what I like about it, what I don't like about it, how it's appropriate for a game I'm working on, how it's not. And like I said before, you need to make sure that the cue is both like aesthetically awesome, but also appropriate, and then put it in the game and test it. And then test it some more, make sure it really sings, like walk away from it for a little bit, come back to it, but really workshop one cue, and then let the composer go. You've reached alignment, and now it's time for them to bring their expertise to bear. So these are a few notes about feedback. Like, everybody has an opinion on music and sometimes sound design in games, but sometimes it can be really hard to break that down into actionable changes to make. To some extent, that's kind of the job of an audio professional, is to interpret feedback from people who don't understand the weird black box that is sound design, and to bring it to bear. Just like when you're giving feedback, a few things to remember. Like, remember that everybody wants to make the game good. There might be disagreements about how to make that happen, but everybody, unless they're really real jerks, has good intentions when you're working together on a game. This one is huge and has like served me so well since I learned it. Like, state problems or impressions, how something makes you feel, but don't give solutions. Allow your partners to bring their expertise to bear to make those solutions happen. And trust in the expertise of your partners and composers. And I realized I didn't talk really a lot about voiceover in this talk, but the same kind of workflow applies. Allow composers and voiceover artists to surprise you. Give them a starting point, but not too much direction, because they've got the ability to make far more awesome stuff than you do if you're working with these partners. So let them go. And like, cross your fingers and hope that they come back with something way more awesome than you could have dreamt of. So, we did it. Game audio. That's like game audio in a nutshell, and game music in a nutshell. Does anybody have any questions on sort of the music side of things, or more questions about audio in general? Sweet. I stunned you all into silence. Well, cool. Thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure. And yeah, if anybody wants to talk more or reach out to me, it's my email, and that's my Twitter handle, but you can also find me pretty much everywhere else under that handle, Nekobus. I used to work by the Neko Wafer Factory, and I like my neighbor Totoro, so I put them together. So yeah, once again, thank you so much, and it was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a few minutes at the end of class for our big question. I think feedback was a great note to end on, so we're actually going to do a little pretend game for feedback. I want you to think of a game that you've played and write an imaginary letter to the sound designer of this game. And in this feedback, it would be great to extol some things that you really liked about their game, but I want you to specifically identify what your suggestions would be to improve the sound design of that game, or what elements of that sound design would you want to change. You can talk with other people to help get ideas, but everybody needs to submit their own response. Regarding 146, you have to get your slides ready. We're presenting on Thursday. And then regarding everyone in the class, if you have not submitted your mid-quarter evaluation yet, your feedback, please do so. I'm going to write the link on this board. Do not leave here today until you have filled out that survey. And Caleb will be around for questions. Thank you so much.
Honestly, half the time I'm playing games, I prepare the music over it.
Really? I think it's time to get gas.
Well, yeah. If it's something like this, yeah, it depends. Like, if you really need the audio, like certain games, you just can't do well without the audio.
Yeah.
And or if it has really good audio, like FTL, I think it's an amazing sound. I've never put music over it, but like you can watch
think one of my problems with the game was it was a small one, but they there wasn't much variety in the radio sounds.
Often go
When you were driving, there were like it was a pretty short list compared to like GTA.
True. Yeah. I found something
I had
interesting
like my own
from Watch
personal
Dogs book, though.
Yeah.
Which surprised me. I was looking through because I've spent far too much time with that game. So I was playing game on Steam.
Really?
But yeah, it's because it used to be like very big and I mean I loved it. That game is actually like it has so much stuff about it. It's just really well done. Nobody really noticed. It's like it's really sadly underrated, mostly because of the whole like graphics style.
Yeah, that was pretty significant, wasn't it?
Yeah, but
They stopped doing it since then.
but dude, I also like I was running shit on a PC that could barely keep up.
I know, but still,
So
it kind of falls short.
I guess.
Yeah.
It wasn't my focus in the game. So
Yeah.
finding chaos fun. But like, what's interesting is most of these songs in the game, on the radio and everything, are actually done by artists from Chicago.
Yeah.
Or like things like that, which is a really interesting choice.
That might be the case in Watch Dogs 2 as well.
I'm not sure if I haven't checked yet.
It seems like a lot of the songs were pretty much made for it, you know?
I mean, there's the game series soundtrack, which is missions and things on the radio. It's like, the game soundtrack is also pretty a bit odd. What is a game that could use better sounds?
I mean, any of the really good examples I can think of, I can't really think of ways to improve the songs.
You gotta think of the padding with things.
Like,
What's something with terrible design?
League of Legends. Just continue dumping on that.
We should ask. Dark Souls has a good soundtrack, actually.
It does.
Tom Clancy, the Siege, kind of needed for that.
Some Skyrim is very good sometimes, but it doesn't have a lot of good songs.
Talking about Call of Duty, you always hear Johnny guitar. Like, anytime you put up the radio, it's freaking Johnny guitar. I can't think of anything that's really bad. Games that stuck out to It's fascinating. Like I said, I don't play many games, but I feel like if it's that, I guess it's good where I live this for me. It's like, especially because like they pick music for the music like for the time.
It works as well as the standard soundtrack, and none of the things were finished, so it was all like,
It's so good. It's surprising. Dang it, why couldn't we just been asking for
yeah.
I really thought that the question was going to be
it's really just like go out and put this
really important sound effect house that standing out. I had a whole answer for it. I was going to talk about carrying the it does a really cool effect where it's a very loud sound, and B, like, you know, on top of everything, but it also, like, cuts out a lot of everything else.
Yeah.
Because it is a move that completely breaks combat flow. It's devastating. So it's really worse that they just, like, it singles out everything. So it's really nice. See you around.
See ya.
Have to do some research. I can't think of anything like sound design that you played it too. What's really interesting is something that I didn't know is that you actually there's really cool stuff like there's a beacon. Most of the time you can see it. There's a fire you can see it. Scanners around for some reason. They actually quiet on that shows. So you can hear like fire people hissing out. It's like really cool. I might talk about that, how it's really well done. Like, I played the game for so long before I used it. I guess it's not
Yes, exactly. Right, it's like, please no. Yeah, I did. Here's why. The sounds that were being used to compare against Overwatch didn't have the same meaning. So I was immediately like, wait a minute, we should take alt sounds and alt sounds and put them together. Now, I still think Overwatch is going to win, but I just didn't, I was like, oh, that's not fair. And like, I just feel bad because they get dumped on so much. And like, they're good people down there. They're like doing hard work. No, that was really what, where I sort of took them. As an announcer, compare apples to apples. So that's why. And I think, like, in all honesty, like, League, when I started playing, like, early stage League, and now League, like, League sounds so much better now. It's like, wow. So, yeah, that's why I don't like it. It's a fun game to play. I just stopped playing it because I couldn't really play a game that required it's hard. It's like, hey, how's it going? Can't team fights. I just watch it. I like love watching the yeah, it's true. Like, I don't think that overall. I don't want to say bad things about work, but yeah, like I don't think Dota sounds like it. I do think their announcement is really good. Although, like, in all honesty, like MOBA, especially a sort of disconnected